The November rain drummed against the kennel's tin roof with the persistence of a debt collector, and our protagonist, let us not burden him with a name, for he could be any of a dozen such men scattered across the Polish estates of the 1880s, sat at his workbench, trimming the nails of a young setter. The dog, barely 8 months old, trembled not from fear, but from barely contained energy, her liver-spotted coat still carrying the puppy softness that would soon give way to the sleek shine of a working hunter. He worked by feel more than sight in the fading afternoon light, his calloused fingers reading the quick of each nail like a blind man reads scripture. 23 years of this work had taught him that dogs, unlike people, never lied about their nature. They might hide illness or injury out of instinct, but they never pretended to be what they were not. "Hold still, little princess," he murmured in Polish, though the dog would have responded the same to Russian or German. Animals, he'd learned, understood tone better than words. The workshop smelled of pine shavings, leather oil, and that particular musk that clings to those who spend their lives among dogs. Along one wall hung leads of various lengths, training whistles worn smooth by use, and a fading photograph of a woman whose gentle eyes suggested she would have approved of the tender way he handled even the most difficult animals. 8 years since tuberculosis took her, and still he found himself setting aside the choicest meat cuts as if she might walk through the door, scolding him for spoiling the dogs. Through the window, his modest kennel stretched toward the Vistula River. 12 runs built from pine and wire, each housing different stages of his breeding program. Not grand like the nobleman's estates, but solid, functional, everything in its place. The sort of operation that attracted serious buyers from as far as Berlin, where Herr Kaufmann had been pestering him about pointer bloodlines for the better part of 1884. A sharp knock interrupted his work. Young Piotr from the post office stood dripping in the doorway, extending an envelope with the practiced indifference of someone who delivered both death notices and love letters with equal detachment. The paper bore the weight and watermark of quality, Prince Radzinski's seal pressed deep into burgundy wax. Our man set down his tools, wiped his hands on the leather apron that had served him since his apprenticeship, and broke the seal. The prince's secretary wrote in the flowery style fashionable among those who had little of substance to say, but considerable time to say it. Yet between the flourishes lay an intriguing proposition. The prince's prize borzoi, Złota, had fallen victim to what His Excellency termed a most peculiar and disturbing malady of supernatural origin. He almost smiled. The nobility, particularly the older Polish aristocracy, clinging to their estates under Russian rule, often saw ghosts where common men saw drafts, and demons where others might notice spoiled meat. Still, Prince Radzinski paid in gold imperials, not promises, and winter was approaching with its usual disregard for the prepared and unprepared alike. The letter requested his immediate attendance, immediately meaning within 3 days, as the prince understood that common men could not simply abandon their responsibilities like leaves falling from trees. A carriage would await him at the Płock station on November 5th, should he choose to accept. Choose. As if choice were a luxury men like him could afford. The mortgage on the kennel land required 40 rubles by month's end, and the setter puppies wouldn't be ready for sale until spring. Besides, there was something in the letter's postscript that intrigued him. The matter requires not only expertise in canine behavior, but also the utmost discretion regarding certain delicate circumstances of a spiritual nature. He folded the letter, placed it in the drawer where he kept important papers, certificates of pedigree, his wife's death notice, correspondence from Herr Kaufmann that grew more insistent with each letter, and returned to the setter's nails. The dog had waited patiently, understanding in that mysterious way of animals that something significant had shifted in her master's world. Later, as he prepared the evening feed, measuring each portion with the precision of an apothecary, he considered what he knew of Sokolniki estate. Prince Rodzinski, last of his line, maintaining the old Polish traditions like a man holding water in cupped hands. The estate itself, 30 kilometers southeast of Warsaw, had supposedly stood since the 1600s, accumulating legends like a ship's hull accumulates barnacles. The dogs ate with enthusiasm, each in their designated spot, the hierarchy of the pack maintained through subtle gestures he had learned to read and respect. Watching them, he thought of Złota, a name meaning golden, and wondered what could disturb a borzoi enough to warrant such a dramatic letter. In his experience, when hunting dogs behaved strangely, the cause was invariably human. That night, he wrote 2 letters by candlelight. The first to Herr Kaufmann, explaining a brief delay in their correspondence due to urgent business. The second to his neighbor, asking him to tend the kennels for a fortnight. As he melted wax for the seals, a drop fell on his scarred left hand, a souvenir from a mastiff who had taught him at age 19 never to assume friendship where only tolerance existed. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving that peculiar silence that follows autumn storms, when the world seems to hold its breath before winter's arrival. Through the window, he could see his dogs settling into their houses, curled into tight circles of warmth and contentment. Tomorrow he would begin preparations for the journey, but tonight he allowed himself the small pleasure of imagining what awaited him at Sokolniki. Certainly not ghosts, but perhaps something far more interesting. A puzzle crafted by human hands, disguised as supernatural mystery. The carriage wheels found every rut in the road from Płotsk station to Sokolniki, as if the very earth conspired to remind visitors that comfort was a privilege reserved for those born to it. Our kennel master sat opposite Prince Rodzinski's man, a nervous fellow named Yusuf, who clutched a rosary with one hand while the other gripped the door handle, prepared for either prayer or escape as circumstances might demand. "The prince hasn't been sleeping," Yusuf confided as they passed through a village where peasants crossed themselves at the sight of the prince's coat of arms. 3 nights now. He sits in his study, watching the kennels through his telescope. The estate emerged from November mist like something from a Polish fairy tale, the kind that ended badly for everyone except the ravens. The main house, built in the old Commonwealth style, spread its wings across manicured grounds that spoke of better times, when Poland was more than a memory carved up between 3 empires. Now, Russian imperial eagles perched uncomfortably beside Polish white eagles on the gateposts, neither looking quite at home. Prince Kazimierz Rodzinski received him in the hunting hall, a cathedral to killing things beautifully. Mounted heads of boar, deer, and wolf stared down with glass eyes that seemed to follow movement. Or perhaps that was merely the effect of afternoon shadows and an old man's paranoia. The prince himself, 67 years mapped across his face like battle lines, wore the elaborate mustache favored by Polish nobility, who remembered when such things mattered. "You came quickly. Good." The prince's voice carried the authority of someone who had never been contradicted in his own home. "Złota is my finest borzoi. 3 generations of breeding, descended from the Tsar's own kennels, a gift for my cooperation during the January Troubles. 1863. The year hung unspoken between them, when Poland last tried to throw off Russian rule and failed, leaving men like the prince to make accommodations that let them keep their lands, if not their honor. "Tell me about the wall," our protagonist said, cutting through ceremony with the precision he used to trim claws. The prince led him through corridors where portraits of ancestors watched their diminished heir with what might have been disappointment. The kennels stood separate from the main house, a stone building older than the current manor, its walls thick enough to withstand siege or storm. Inside, the familiar scent of dog mixed with something else. Fear, sharp and acrid, the kind that infected entire packs if left unchecked. They stopped before a pen where a magnificent borzoi stood rigid, every muscle tensed, staring at a section of the eastern wall. Złota, golden indeed, her coat the color of wheat before harvest, did not acknowledge their presence. Her eyes remained fixed on old stones that looked no different from any others, yet she trembled as if confronting something terrible. "Watch," the prince commanded. As if on cue, Złota threw back her head and howled. Not the musical bay of a hunting hound, but something primal, mournful, ending in a snarl as she hurled herself at the wall. Her paws scrabbled against stone, leaving bloody tracks before she retreated to repeat the performance. 3 days of this. She won't eat, barely drinks. My veterinarian says she's healthy, but what does he know? He's from Moscow. The prince spat, a gesture that could cost him his estate if reported to the wrong authorities. Father Stanislav appeared as if summoned by the mention of spiritual matters, his cassock rustling like autumn leaves. 55 years of hearing confessions had given him a face that revealed nothing while suggesting he knew everything. "Perhaps our visitor should hear the story of Tomasz." The priest spoke with the practiced rhythm of someone who had told this tale many times, polishing it like a river stone. In 1720, a servant named Tomasz had betrayed his master's trust. The exact nature of the betrayal changed with each telling, though it always involved either women or money, the two eternal sources of men's downfall. The master, a Radzinski ancestor naturally, had ordered Tomasz walled up alive in the kennels as an example to others. "They say on quiet nights you can hear him scratching," Father Stanislaw concluded, crossing himself with theatrical precision. Our kennel master approached the wall, ignoring Złota's increasing agitation. His scarred hand ran across the stones, feeling for temperature changes, air currents, anything that might affect a dog's sensitive perception. The mortar was old but solid, no gaps that might harbor rats or emit sounds. Yet as he leaned close, something tickled his nostrils. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. Anise. Like the Easter bread his grandmother used to bake, but concentrated, medicinal. The scent clung to one section of wall, exactly where Złota focused her attention. "Who has access to the kennels?" he asked, straightening slowly, his bad leg protesting the crouch. "Everyone and no one," Prince Radzinski replied. "The doors are never locked. What thief would dare steal from me? But only the kennel boys and Pavel, my head groom, work here regularly." Mikhail Petrovich, the Russian estate manager, materialized from the shadows where he had been observing. Everything about him was neat, ordered, from his trimmed beard to his Western-style suit that marked him as a man of the new order. "This is superstitious nonsense," he declared in accented Polish. "The dog is simply ill, perhaps rabid." "Rabid dogs don't behave so specifically," our protagonist countered, meeting the Russian's gaze steadily. "And they certainly don't respond to anise oil." The room fell silent, except for Złota's continued whimpering. Prince Radzinski's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the Vistula. "Anise oil? Someone has been applying it to this section of wall. Regularly, I'd guess, given the intensity of the scent. For hunting dogs, especially sight hounds like Borzoi, certain concentrated scents can cause extreme distress. It overwhelms their senses, creates a kind of temporary madness." Young Yannick, a boy of 14 with the eager eyes of someone desperate to escape the potato fields, had been listening from the doorway. "But who would do such a thing to Złota? She's the prince's favorite." Indeed, our kennel master thought, studying the faces around him. Who would risk the prince's wrath for what seemed a petty cruelty? Unless, of course, the cruelty wasn't petty at all, but served some larger purpose. In his experience, when animals suffered mysteriously, one need only look for who profited from their suffering. The prince dismissed them all except our protagonist. In the fading light, the old nobleman looked his age, perhaps more. "Find who did this," he said quietly. "I care nothing for ghosts or legends, but someone has tried to harm what is mine, and in my house, that cannot stand." As our kennel master left the building, he noticed Powell, the groom, watching from the stable doors, his expression unreadable in the growing dusk. 31 years old, Yusuf had mentioned during the carriage ride, recently married, a favorite of the prince for his skill with horses. Yet something in his posture, a tension that reminded our protagonist of a dog preparing to bolt, suggested that Powell knew more about anise oil than a groom ought to know. Morning fog clung to the Sokolniki estate like a guilty conscience, and our kennel master woke in the servants' quarters to the sound of roosters announcing dawn with military precision. The narrow bed had been better than many he'd known, though his back complained about the horsehair mattress that had seen better decades. Through the small window, he could see stable boys beginning their rounds, their breath visible in the November cold. He dressed methodically: wool trousers, linen shirt, the leather vest that had served him through 20 winters, and made his way to the kitchen where the staff would be most honest before the day taught them caution. The cook, a formidable woman named Katarzyna, ruled her domain with an iron ladle and the kind of gossip network that would make Russian secret police envious. "You're the dog man," she stated rather than asked, pushing a bowl of thick porridge before him without ceremony. "Eat! You're too thin. Dogs need meat on their bones, and so do those who handle them." The kitchen bustled with the controlled chaos of feeding a great house, even a diminished one. Scullery maids peeled turnips while discussing last Sunday's sermon, their hands never pausing despite animated conversation. Our protagonist ate slowly, listening to the rhythm of servant life, understanding that more truth lived in these casual exchanges than in any formal interrogation. Young Janek appeared, ostensibly to fetch hot water for the kennels, but clearly hoping to attach himself to the investigation. His father, a field hand named Wojtek, followed shortly after, his weathered face set in disapproving lines. "The boy has work in the stables," Wojtek announced, his Polish heavily accented with the local dialect, "not chasing after gentlemen's fantasies." "Knowledge of animals is always useful," our kennel master replied mildly, recognizing the fear behind the father's brusqueness. The terror that his son might reach beyond his station and fall further than their family could afford to catch him. Father Stanisław entered, accepting tea with the elaborate gratitude of someone who understood that kitchens, not confessionals, were where souls truly revealed themselves. "You wish to know more about our haunted wall," he said, settling his considerable frame onto a bench that creaked in protest. "I wish to know about changes," our protagonist corrected. "New people, new routines. Ghosts, in my experience, are remarkably consistent. It's the living who surprise us." The priest's eyes sharpened with intelligence often hidden behind ecclesiastical theatrics. 3 months ago, we had new staff arrive. Mikhail Petrovich brought some of his people from Warsaw. Modernizers, he calls them. The young stable hand Dmitri, the new groundskeeper. There was friction. Katarzyna snorted, attacking bread dough with particular violence. Friction. Is that what we're calling it when Polish workers are replaced by Russians who work for less? Not replaced, Father Stanisław corrected carefully. Supplemented. The prince still employs many local people. Pavel remains head groom after all. At Pavel's name, a scullery maid giggled, then caught herself. Our kennel master noticed the quick glances exchanged among the kitchen staff, the universal look of people who knew something delicious but dangerous to share. "Pavel's been distracted lately," Katarzyna finally offered, her tone suggesting this was merely practical information. "New wife, baby coming. Men get stupid when babies come, worried about money, worried about everything." Janek, who had been trying to make himself invisible to avoid his father's summons back to the stables, suddenly spoke. "He was asking about the winter hunt wages last week, whether the prince would give bonuses if the hunt went well." The winter hunt, of course. Every December, Prince Rosinsky hosted neighboring nobility for a grand hunt, a tradition maintaining his social standing despite political realities. Złota, as his finest borzoi, would be expected to perform magnificently, reflecting her master's glory. A sick or mad dog would be not just an embarrassment, but a social catastrophe. Our protagonist rose, thanking Katarzyna for the breakfast, and made his way toward the kennels, with Janek somehow materializing at his side despite Wojtek's obvious displeasure. The boy had the gift of moving quietly, a skill learned by those who survived by not being noticed. "Show me where supplies are kept," he instructed the boy, who brightened at being given a task. The storage room adjoined the kennels, filled with the equipment of centuries of hunting tradition. Leather leads hung beside modern chain ones. Ancient brass whistles shared shelves with newer German imports. Everything meticulously organized, each item in its designated place, except for a gap on one shelf where dust outlined something recently removed. "What belonged there?" our kennel master asked. Janek frowned, thinking. "Medicine bottles, I think, for treating wounds. But Pavel reorganized everything last month, said the prince wanted modernization." Interesting. Our protagonist ran his finger along the shelf, noting the residue that suggested glass bottles had indeed stood there recently. The faint scent of anise still lingered, though whether from the missing bottles or contamination from the wall remained unclear. They examined the wall itself in daylight, Złota watching warily from her pen, exhausted from her nighttime battles with invisible enemies. The stones were indeed old, some dating perhaps to the original structure, but one section, roughly at a dog's eye level, showed signs of repeated cleaning. The mortar slightly worn, the stone surface smoother than its neighbors. "Someone's been wiping this section," he observed, more to himself than Janek. "Regularly. You can see the pattern." A shadow fell across the doorway. Pavel stood there, his expression carefully neutral, though our kennel master noticed how his hands clenched and unclenched, a nervous tell that would have lost him money at any card table. "The prince wants to know if you found anything," the groom said, his voice steady despite those restless hands. "Several things," our protagonist replied, watching Pavel's face carefully. "All of them interesting. Tell me, how long have you worked with Zwota?" "Since she was a pup, 3 years now." Pride crept into Pavel's voice despite his obvious tension. "I helped train her for her first hunt." "Then her suffering must pain you greatly." Pavel's jaw tightened. "Of course. She's a magnificent animal. To see her like this." He gestured helplessly toward the pen where Zwota lay panting, her golden coat dark with sweat. "Indeed. By the way, where might one obtain anise oil in these parts? For medical purposes, of course." The question hung in the air like incense at a funeral. Pavel's face went through several expressions before settling on confused innocence. A moment too late to be genuine. "The apothecary in town, I suppose, or Warsaw? Why do you ask?" Our kennel master smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Curiosity. I find it useful in treating certain conditions. Though, of course, one must be careful with the concentration. Too much can cause quite dramatic reactions in sensitive animals." Pavel excused himself abruptly, claiming urgent business in the stables. Youngek watched him go with the sharp attention of youth that sees everything, but doesn't always understand what it means. "He's scared," the boy observed. "Yes," our protagonist agreed, examining the wall once more. "The question is whether he fears for Zwota, for himself, or for someone else entirely." The morning sun had finally burned through the fog, revealing the estate in all its faded glory. Somewhere in this carefully maintained illusion of past grandeur, someone had decided that driving a dog mad served their purposes. The why remained hidden, but our kennel master had learned that in houses like this, where tradition and change wrestled daily, the why usually involved those two eternal motivators Father Stanislav had mentioned: women or money. And sometimes, he reflected, watching Pavel hurry toward the stables where his new wife worked in the laundry, it involved both. The afternoon brought unexpected rain, drumming against the windows of the estate office where Mikhail Petrovich conducted his modernization of Prince Radzinski's affairs. Our kennel master had requested access to the household records, a bold move for someone of his station. But the Russian manager, perhaps eager to prove the superiority of his systematic approach, had agreed. "Everything is documented," Mikhail Petrovich announced with satisfaction, gesturing to ledgers arranged like soldiers on parade. "Every expense, every wage, every transaction. Not like the old Polish ways of handshakes and promises." The records told their own story. Wages paid punctually on the first of each month, supplies ordered from approved vendors in Warsaw, even a new system for tracking the breeding lines of the prince's hunting dogs. Our protagonist ran his finger down columns of figures, noting patterns that spoke of efficient management, but also subtle tensions. "This entry," he said, pointing to a notation from late October. "Additional advance to P. Kowalczyk, 800 rubles. That's significant." Mikhail Petrovich frowned, consulting his notes. "The autumn fair. Several of the men requested advances for the harvest celebration. It's traditional, though I advised against it. These local customs encourage financial irresponsibility." 800 rubles, more than a year's wages for a head groom. Our kennel master kept his expression neutral, while his mind calculated what could drive a man to borrow so heavily. Through the window, he could see the stables where Pavel worked, his movements sharp and agitated as he directed the stable boys. Young Yannick appeared in the doorway, water dripping from his cap. "Sir, Katarzyna says you should come to the kitchen. She says it's about the fair." The kitchen had transformed into a court of feminine judgment. Katarzyna presided over her domain, while several other women, laundry maids, scullery girls, even Agnieszka, Pavel's young wife, sat around the great wooden table, ostensibly working, but clearly assembled for a purpose. "Tell him what you told me," Katerina commanded, a thin woman our protagonist recognized as Anna, who worked in the dairy. Anna glanced nervously at Agnieszka before speaking. "At the autumn fair, there was wagering. There always is, but this year—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "Some of the men got caught up in the excitement. There was a traveling merchant from Krakow, had a fighting dog, huge beast. Said he'd take any bet that no local dog could best his in a match." "Pavel bet against him?" our kennel master asked, though he suspected the truth was more complex. "Not a fight," Anna clarified. "A hunt. The merchant bet his dog could catch more hares in a day than any estate hound. The stakes kept rising, men drinking, pride involved. You know how it gets." Indeed he did. He'd seen it countless times. Alcohol and masculine pride creating a volatile mixture that burned through common sense like fire through dry straw. Agnieszka spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pavel was defending the prince's honor. Everyone was laughing, saying Polish nobles kept inferior dogs, that Russian wolfhounds or German pointers were superior. Pavel couldn't stand it. So he wagered on Złota," our protagonist concluded. "Not just wagered," Katarzyna interjected. "He bet everything. Said Złota would outrun any dog in the coming winter hunt. 800 rubles at 3-to-1 odds. If she wins, he clears his debts and more. If she loses, Pavel faces debtor's prison, leaving his pregnant wife destitute." The kitchen fell silent, each woman contemplating this familiar tragedy. Men gambling with money they didn't have, on contests they couldn't control. Our kennel master studied Agnieszka. Perhaps 20 years old, pretty in the way of peasant girls, before hardship carved itself into their faces. Her hand rested protectively on her still flat stomach, though the other women's knowing looks suggested her condition was an open secret. "When is the winter hunt?" he asked. "December 15th, Katarzyna replied. "St. Stephen's feast. The merchant will return with his dog. Half the district knows about the wager now. The prince doesn't. Pavel made sure of that. But everyone else watches and whispers." A thought occurred to our protagonist. If Złota can't run, if she's deemed mad or sick, what happens to the bet? "Forfeit," Anna said. "Pavel loses everything immediately." But that made no sense. Why would Pavel poison the very dog he needed to win? Unless... Our kennel master felt pieces clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. "Who else knows about the anise oil?" he asked suddenly. The women exchanged glances. Finally, Katarzyna spoke. "That Russian stable boy, Dmitri. He was boasting last week about knowing ways to train dogs that Polish handlers never learn. Said something about sense that could make a dog do anything. Dmitri, one of Mikhail Petrovich's modernizers. Our protagonist rose, thanking the women for their honesty, and noticed how Agnieszka caught his sleeve as he passed. "Pavel is a good man," she whispered urgently. "He made a terrible mistake, but he would never hurt Złota. She's his pride." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp and clean. Our kennel master found Janek waiting, eager as a hunting dog on a fresh scent. "I know where Dmitri keeps his things," the boy offered without preamble. "In the old tack room. He thinks no one notices, but I see everything." They walked toward the stables, our protagonist's mind working through possibilities. If Dmitri was sabotaging Złota, was it mere cruelty, or did he have his own stake in the wager? Russians and Poles, old traditions and new methods, all tangled together like fighting dogs that had forgotten what started the battle. The tack room smelled of leather and oil, decades of both soaked into the wooden walls. Dmitri's corner was methodically organized, very Russian, very modern. Among his possessions, wrapped in cloth behind a row of brushes, sat a dark glass bottle. Our kennel master uncorked it carefully, and the concentrated scent of anise filled the small space. "That's it," Janek said, unnecessarily. "That's what's on the wall." But as our protagonist rewrapped the bottle, leaving it exactly as found, he noticed something else. A folded paper tucked beneath Dmitri's personal effects. He shouldn't look. Knew it exceeded his authority, but investigations rarely succeeded by respecting boundaries. The paper was a betting slip from the autumn fair, but not what he expected. Dmitri hadn't bet on his own dog or against Złota. He'd bet on the complete opposite outcome, that Złota would fail to compete at all. A smaller wager than Pavel's, but at 20-to-1 odds, enough to make a stable boy wealthy if the dog was declared unfit. "He's making her crazy so she can't race," Janek said, understanding dawning on his young face. "Perhaps," our kennel master replied, though something still bothered him. The setup was too neat, too obvious. In his experience, when evidence presented itself this clearly, it meant someone wanted it found. Evening approached as they emerged from the tack room. Across the yard, our protagonist could see Pavel talking intently with someone in the shadows. From the posture and gestures, it appeared to be Dmitri. Two men who should be enemies, conferring like conspirators. "Fetch Mikhail Petrovich," he told Janek. "Tell him to bring the prince. Say that I've found something interesting about his modernization efforts." As the boy ran off, our kennel master stood in the gathering dusk, watching the two men in the shadows. The anise oil was real. The wall poisoning was real. Złota's suffering was certainly real. But underneath these facts lay a deeper game, one where Polish pride and Russian authority were merely pieces on a board, and a golden dog's madness might serve more purposes than one. The truth, he suspected, was both simpler and more complex than anyone imagined. Men in desperate circumstances rarely acted alone, and sometimes enemies found common ground in mutual desperation. The only innocent party in all of this was Złota herself, driven to madness by human schemes she could never understand. The estate's old library served as an unlikely laboratory that November 9th morning. Our kennel master had requested a space away from prying eyes, and Prince Radzinski, increasingly intrigued by the investigation's direction, had granted him use of the dusty room where leather-bound volumes in Polish, Latin, and French chronicled centuries of declining fortune. On the great oak table, our protagonist arranged his materials with the precision of a chemist. Various oils and essences borrowed from the kitchen and stable, clean cloths, several chunks of bread, and Most importantly, 3 hunting dogs of different breeds, a pointer, a setter, and a young borzoi from Zwata's own bloodline. Yannick assisted with the eager attention of an apprentice who sensed he was witnessing something important. Knowledge, our kennel master explained as he prepared dilutions of different concentrations, comes not from what we assume, but from what we can prove. The priests tell us about faith, but dogs teach us about evidence. He began with lavender oil, dabbing it on cloth and observing each dog's reaction. Mild interest, nothing more. Then rosemary. The pointer sneezed, the setter ignored it entirely. Peppermint caused all 3 to back away, but without distress, merely distaste. Then came the anise. Even diluted to 1 part in 10 with water, the reaction was immediate. The pointer began whining, pawing at his nose. The setter circled frantically, unable to settle. But the young borzoi, her response was most dramatic. She howled, a sound that raised the hair on human necks, and threw herself against the kennel wire with such violence that our protagonist immediately removed the scented cloth. "It's like they're seeing something that isn't there," Yannick observed, his voice hushed with a mixture of fascination and horror. Not seeing, smelling, but so intensely that their brains cannot process it normally. Imagine if someone shone the brightest light directly into your eyes continuously. You'd see nothing but white fire. Might even believe you were blind. They repeated the experiment with different concentrations, our kennel master taking careful notes in his small leather journal. At certain strengths, the anise caused mild agitation. Too weak, and the dogs merely noticed it. But at one specific concentration, roughly what he'd detected on the wall, the reaction was consistent. Profound distress, disorientation, and in the case of sighthounds like borzoi, aggressive behavior toward the source. Mikhail Petrovich arrived as they were concluding, his neat appearance somewhat ruffled. "The prince is occupied with correspondence, but asks for your findings. This business with oils and dogs, very scientific, very modern. I approve." The Russian's approval meant little to our protagonist, but his presence offered an opportunity. "Tell me about Dmitri. You brought him from Warsaw?" "From Moscow, actually, through Warsaw." "Excellent references. Trained at the imperial stables. Russia produces the finest animal handlers in Europe." The manager's chest puffed with nationalistic pride. "And his interest in betting?" Mikhail Petrovich's expression soured. "These peasants and their gambling. I've warned him repeatedly. It's why they remain poor. No understanding of financial discipline." Interesting, our kennel master thought, that the manager knew about his subordinates gambling but had done nothing to stop it. He made a mental note while appearing to organize his experimental materials. Father Stanislaw appeared in the doorway, his substantial frame blocking the light. "I heard howling. The servants are saying you're summoning the ghost of Tomas. Merely demonstrating that ghosts often have earthly explanations, Father. Though I wonder, in your records of the original incident, was there mention of what trade Tomas practiced before his unfortunate end?" The priest's eyes sharpened. "Curious you should ask. I reviewed the parish records last night. Tomas was the estate's hound master. Rather poetic, isn't it? Walled up in the very kennels where he once worked." Poetic indeed. Our protagonist wondered if someone else had known this detail and found it useful for their current deception. History, he'd learned, provided excellent cover for contemporary crimes. Young Janek had been examining the anise bottle from Dimitri's collection, comparing it to the kitchen's supply. "This one's different," he announced. "Stronger smell, darker color." Our kennel master took the bottle, examining it in the light streaming through dusty windows. The boy was right. This was concentrated anise oil, pharmaceutical grade, not the cooking essence found in kitchens. The label, partially worn, showed Cyrillic letters. "Russian manufacture," Mikhail Petrovich confirmed, then frowned. "But how would Dmitri afford such things? This would cost significant money." "Unless someone gave it to him," our protagonist suggested. "Someone who needed a Russian servant to take the blame if the scheme was discovered." The room fell silent as implications settled like dust after a disturbance. Our kennel master continued his methodical packing of materials, allowing others to draw their own conclusions. Sometimes the best revelations came from letting people convince themselves. "You're suggesting conspiracy," Father Stanislav said slowly. "But between whom?" "I suggest nothing yet, Father. I merely observe that concentrated anise oil affects hunting dogs dramatically, that someone has been applying it to a specific section of wall, and that multiple people have financial interests in Zwota's fitness or lack thereof." Through the library windows, they could see Pavel crossing the courtyard, carrying feed buckets toward the kennels. His shoulders were hunched against more than just the November cold, and he kept glancing around as if expecting accusation to leap from every shadow. "We should test the wall itself," Janek suggested with the simple logic of youth. "Clean one section, see if Zwota calms." "An excellent proposal," our protagonist agreed. "But first, we must ensure no one reapplies the substance. Tonight, you and I will watch. But secretly, let the poisoner think his work continues undetected." Mikhail Petrovich departed to report to the prince, muttering about the backwardness of people who would harm a valuable animal for mere money. Father Stanislav lingered, his intelligent eyes studying our kennel master. "You know who's doing this," the priest said. It wasn't a question. "I know several people are doing several things, Father. Whether they're doing them together or in competition remains to be seen. Truth is rarely as simple as we'd prefer." The priest smiled, an expression that transformed his heavy features. "Spoken like a true philosopher or a detective." "Merely a man who breeds dogs, Father. But dogs teach us that the pack is never as simple as it appears. Alpha and Omega are clear enough, but in between, alliances shift, conspiracies form and dissolve, all based on advantage and survival." As evening approached, our protagonist prepared for surveillance. He positioned himself in the loft above the kennels, where hay bales provided concealment and a clear view of the haunted wall. Janek took position near the stable, tasked with tracking anyone's approach. The November night settled over Sokolniki like a thick blanket, muffling sounds and obscuring movements. Zwota had finally exhausted herself and lay panting in her pen, occasionally whimpering at shadows only she could see. Our kennel master settled into his watch, patient as a hunter waiting for game, knowing that desperate men rarely resisted the urge to ensure their schemes progressed. In his pocket, his journal contained notes not just about anise oil and dog behavior, but about human patterns, debts and wages, pride and fear, the delicate balance between old Poland and new Russia that created opportunities for those willing to exploit them. The truth was forming like a photograph in developing solution, still unclear but gaining definition. Somewhere in the darkness, someone would come to refresh the anise on the wall. And when they did, our kennel master would be watching, adding one more piece to a puzzle that was becoming as much about human nature as canine behavior. The loft had grown cold by midnight, November's chill seeping through cracks in the old timber. Our kennel master shifted carefully among the hay bales, his joints protesting the prolonged stillness. Below, Zwota slept fitfully, her golden form occasionally twitching, as if even dreams brought no peace from the anise-induced torment. 3 hours of watching had produced nothing but the regular sounds of a sleeping estate, distant snoring from the servants' quarters, the occasional stamp of horses in their stalls, an owl conducting its own hunt in the darkness beyond. Our protagonist had nearly decided to abandon the vigil when he heard it. The soft scrape of a door opening where no door should open. A figure emerged from inside the kennel building itself, from what appeared to be solid wall. The moonlight, filtering through clouds, revealed Pavel, moving with the careful steps of someone who had made this journey many times. But instead of approaching the haunted wall, he went to Zwota's pen, producing something from his pocket. "Easy, my golden one," the groom whispered, his Polish tender with genuine affection. "Just a little longer. I'm so sorry." He wasn't applying anise. He was feeding her something. Small pieces that Zwota, despite her distress, accepted eagerly. Medicine? Poison? Our kennel master tensed, preparing to intervene, when another figure materialized from the shadows. Dmitri. The Russian stable boy moved like smoke, barely disturbing the straw beneath his feet. In his hand, a dark bottle caught the moonlight. The two men faced each other across Zwota's pen, and for a moment, our protagonist thought violence would erupt.
"You weren't supposed to come tonight," Pavel hissed. "And you weren't supposed to feed her," Dmitri replied in accented Polish. "We agreed. She must appear completely mad." "She's suffering enough. The bread soaked in valerian helps her sleep without affecting the symptoms." Valerian, a mild sedative harmless to dogs. Our kennel master revised his assessment of Pavel, not a poisoner, but a man trying to minimize the damage he was enabling. "Your sentiment will ruin everything," Dmitri said, moving toward the wall with his bottle. "My uncle in Moscow told me this would work, and it has. 3 more days, and she'll be declared unfit. We both win." "You win," Pavel corrected bitterly. "You collect your bet. I merely avoid prison." The full picture crystallized in our protagonist's mind. Not conspiracy, but parallel desperation. 2 men, each with their own reasons for wanting Zwota disqualified, one providing the method, the other allowing it to happen. Neither trusted the other, hence the separate midnight visits. Dmitri began applying anise oil to the wall with practiced movements, using a cloth to spread it evenly across the stones. The scent, even from the loft, was overwhelming. Below, Zwota stirred, beginning the low whine that would build to howling by dawn. "Enough," Pavel said suddenly. "This ends tonight." Dmitri turned, his young face hard with the premature cynicism of those who'd learned early that life owed them nothing. "You end it, you lose everything. Your wife, your position, probably your life in prison. Is one dog worth that? Is your bet worth destroying a man's life? You destroyed your own life when you wagered 800 rubles you didn't have." They stood frozen in mutual antagonism, neither yielding.
Our kennel master chose this moment to shift deliberately, causing hay to rustle. Both men looked up, panic flashing across their faces. "Run or stay," our protagonist called down calmly, "but choose quickly."
Yanek is already fetching Mikhail Petrovich.
Dmitri bolted immediately, disappearing into the darkness with the speed of youth and fear. Pavel remained, shoulders sagging in defeat or perhaps relief. He sat heavily on a bench beside Zwota's pen, his hand reaching through to stroke her golden coat. Our kennel master descended from the loft, his bad leg nearly buckling after hours of stillness. He sat beside the groom, two men in the darkness with a suffering dog between them. "My wife is pregnant," Pavel said unnecessarily. "Her first. We married in June, just before the harvest. I wanted to give her everything. A good life, security, children who wouldn't have to bow to every passing nobleman. So you bet on certainty, Zwota's speed. She's magnificent, was magnificent before." He gestured helplessly at the anise-soaked wall. "Dmitri approached me after I'd lost. Said he knew a way we could both profit. He'd bet on her failing to compete. Small amounts spread across several bookmakers. I just had to look the other way while he did this." "But you couldn't truly look away." "How could I? I raised her from 8 weeks old, taught her to course hares, to read the wind, to trust her instincts. Now I've taught her that even familiar places can become nightmares." Young Janek appeared with a lantern, followed by Mikhail Petrovich in a hastily donned coat. The Russian manager surveyed the scene, the anise bottle dropped by Dmitri in his flight, Pavel slumped in defeat, our kennel master standing as witness. "So," Mikhail Petrovich said heavily, "my modernization brings modern crimes. Where is Dmitri?" "Gone," our protagonist replied, "and best he stays gone. One confession is cleaner than 2 accusations." The manager understood immediately. Russian justice and Polish justice might differ in methods, but both recognized the value of clear resolution.
"Pavel Kowalczyk, you will explain this to Prince Rodzinski in the morning. He'll have me arrested." "Perhaps, or perhaps he'll remember that his grandfather once wagered an entire village on a card game and lost. Pride and foolishness aren't limited to servants." Our kennel master knelt beside Zwota's pen, studying the dog who watched him with eyes that held too much white, too much fear. "Bring vinegar and strong soap. We'll clean the wall tonight. The anise has soaked into the mortar, but we can neutralize most of it." They worked until dawn, scrubbing stones that had stood for over a century, removing the chemical ghost that had haunted them. Zwota watched, her whimpering gradually subsiding as the overwhelming scent faded. By the time the sun rose over Sokolniki, she had finally fallen into true sleep, her breathing deep and regular. Pavel worked hardest of all, his hands raw from the harsh soap, as if he could scrub away his guilt along with the anise. "What will you tell the prince?" he asked our protagonist. "The truth, that men in desperate circumstances make desperate choices, that loyalty and betrayal can exist in the same heart, that sometimes the real ghost is the fear of poverty that haunts every working man." "Philosophy won't save me from prison." "No," our kennel master agreed, "but the prince's need for a skilled groom might. Zwota still needs to win that wager in December. She'll need training to overcome this trauma, patient work to restore her confidence. You're the only one who can do it." Hope, fragile as morning frost, flickered in Pavel's eyes. Mikhail Petrovich observed this exchange with interest, perhaps recognizing that practical solutions often succeeded where rigid justice failed. "Clean this mess," the Russian commanded. "All of it. Then report to the prince after morning mass. And Pavel, If you run, I'll find you myself." As they dispersed in the gray dawn light, our protagonist remained beside Zwota's pen.
The golden borzoi stirred, her brown eyes focusing on him with the clarity that had been absent for days. She stood, stretched with careful dignity, and approached the wall that had been her tormentor. She sniffed once, sneezed at the vinegar scent, then turned away with sublime indifference. The prince's study occupied the corner tower of Sokolniki Manor, its windows offering commanding views of lands that stretched toward the Vistula. November 13th had dawned gray and bitter, matching the mood that pervaded the estate since word of the night's discoveries had spread through the servant quarters like spilled wine across linen. Our kennel master stood beside the great fireplace, watching Prince Rogzinski pace before his ancestors' portraits. Pavel knelt in the center of the room, not ordered to, but choosing the position of penitence from centuries of inherited understanding about how the guilty should present themselves to power. His wife, Agnieszka, had been permitted to stand beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, her pregnancy now visible beneath her woolen dress. 800 rubles, the prince repeated for the third time, his voice containing the special disgust reserved for those who'd violated not just law, but proper order. "You wagered 800 rubles on my dog, without my knowledge, without my permission." "Yes, Your Excellency," Pavel whispered. Mikhail Petrovitch stood near the door, a ledger in his hands, representing the new order of documentation and accountability. Father Stanislav occupied a chair by the window, present as both spiritual counsel and witness. The room held the weight of judgment pending, that particular tension when power decides how to exercise itself. "Tell me everything," the prince commanded. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out, or I'll have you taken to Warsaw immediately." Pavel's confession emerged slowly, like blood from a deep wound. The autumn fair's excitement, the traveling merchant's mockery of Polish hunting traditions, the vodka that made courage seem wisdom. How the bet had started small, 50 rubles on a simple contest, then grown as others joined, as pride replaced sense. "He kept saying Polish nobles were finished," Pavel explained, his voice gaining strength through indignation, "that we were museum pieces, keeping inferior animals for inferior hunts. He said Russian wolfhounds or German pointers would destroy any Polish dog. I couldn't. Your Excellency's reputation—" "My reputation," the prince interrupted coldly, "was not yours to defend with money you didn't possess." The groom's shoulders sagged. He continued with the rest, the horrible realization the next morning of what he'd done, the weeks of growing panic as December approached, then Dmitri's approach with his proposition. He knew about the anise from his uncle in Moscow. Said it was used to train difficult dogs, but in concentration, it would drive them mad, temporarily. No permanent harm, he promised, just enough to disqualify Zwata from competition. "And you agreed to torture my finest hound?" Pavel's voice broke. "I told myself it was temporary, that after the hunt was canceled, she would recover. I never meant—" Agnieszka spoke for the first time, her peasant Polish, careful but clear. "He came home crying that first night, Your Excellency, after he saw what the anise did to her. He wanted to confess then, but I begged him not to, for our child's sake." Our kennel master observed how the prince's expression shifted at this admission, the young wife taking partial blame, invoking the unborn child. These were old patterns, older than the estate itself, ways that servants had always negotiated with power. "You fed her valerian," our protagonist interjected, drawing attention back to facts.
To ease her suffering while maintaining the deception. That suggests conscience, at least.
Prince Radzinski turned his sharp gaze on our kennel master. "You defend him?"
"I observe, Your Excellency. A man without conscience would have simply let the dog suffer. Pavel tried to minimize the damage while caught between two disasters, prison for debt or discovery of the deception."
Pretty philosophy won't erase his betrayal.
"No, Your Excellency. But perhaps practical consideration might. Złota needs careful rehabilitation if she's to race in December. She trusts Pavel, despite what's happened. You need him, and he certainly needs you." The prince stood at the window looking out at his domain. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weariness of a man who'd outlived his era.
My grandfather once wagered this entire estate on which raindrop would reach the bottom of a window first. Lost half our best farmland. My father bet our forests on a chess game with a Russian general.
"Lost those, too." He turned back to face the room. "We nobles gamble with estates and villages, destroy 1,000 lives with our foolishness, and call it aristocratic privilege. A groom gambles with 800 rubles he doesn't have, and we call it crime." Father Stanislav shifted in his chair. "Your Excellency suggests mercy?" "I suggest proportion, Father. Tell me, Pavel, if Złota wins in December, what would your winnings be?"
2,400 rubles, Your Excellency, 3-to-1 odds.
"And you owe 800. The prince calculated silently. "Very well. This is my judgment. You will train Złota for December's hunt. If she wins, your winnings go first to your debt, the remainder to me as compensation for this betrayal. You will then serve 3 additional years without wage, working only for room and board." Pavel's head shot up, hope flickering in his eyes. "Your Excellency means—" "I mean you're a fool. But a fool I've invested considerable time training."
"Prison would cost me a skilled groom and gain me nothing. This way, perhaps something useful comes from your idiocy." "And if Złota loses?" Mikhail Petrovich asked, ever practical. The prince's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Then Pavel goes to prison. His wife goes to the poorhouse, and I lose a dog already driven half mad. So he'd better ensure she doesn't lose." Our kennel master recognized the cruel elegance of this solution. Pavel's fate now tied completely to his ability to heal what he'd helped destroy. Justice and pragmatism wrapped together like strands in a rope. "There's still Dmitri," the Russian manager noted. "He won't simply disappear."
"He already has," Father Stanislav announced. "Took a morning cock to Warsaw. But he left something interesting."
The priest produced a folded paper.
A full confession, written in Russian and Polish. He fears deportation to Siberia more than local justice.
The prince took the confession, scanning it quickly.
"He implicates only himself and Pavel. Nothing about orders from above or conspiracy among the Russians. How convenient." "Your Excellency suspects broader involvement?" our protagonist asked. "I suspect everyone and trust no one. It's how Polish nobles survive under Russian rule." The prince moved to his desk, pulling out a leather purse. "Your work here is complete. You've solved my ghost problem and uncovered a very human crime. Your fee." The purse was heavy with gold imperials, more than initially promised.
Our kennel master accepted it with a slight bow, understanding that excess payment bought silence as much as service. "I'd like to remain a few more days," he said, "to help establish a rehabilitation routine for Złota. No additional fee required." Prince Radziński studied him with eyes that had seen every variation of human motivation. Guilt, curiosity, or compassion? Professional interest, Your Excellency. I've never seen a case quite like this.
The recovery could teach me valuable things about trauma in hunting dogs. It was partially true, though our protagonist also felt responsibility for these lives he'd helped expose. Pavel and Agnieszka's future, Złota's recovery, even young Janek's education. Threads he'd pulled that deserved proper weaving. "Stay, then," the prince agreed. "But remember, this is Poland under Russian rule. We perform our little dramas, maintain our small dignities, but the real power lies elsewhere. Don't mistake my mercy for weakness or my pragmatism for forgiveness." As they filed from the study, Pavel stopped our kennel master in the corridor. Tears ran freely down the groom's weathered face. "You saved our lives. How can I repay you?" "Win in December," our protagonist replied simply. Prove that Polish dogs and Polish handlers still have worth. Through the window, he could see Złota in the kennels, standing tall for the first time in days, her golden coat catching what little sun penetrated the November clouds. She would need patience, consistency, and most importantly, the steady hand of someone she trusted despite betrayal. The morning of November 14th brought an unexpected visitor to Sokolniki. Herr Friedrich Kaufmann himself, arriving in a hired carriage laden with crates that suggested commerce rather than courtesy. Our kennel master discovered this development when young Janek burst into the kennels where he and Pavel were working with Złota, the boy's excitement overwhelming his usual deference. "There's a German here asking for you," Janek announced breathlessly. "Says he couldn't wait for replies to letters, had to see your dogs himself." Our protagonist's stomach tightened. The Berlin merchant's timing couldn't be worse. Yet, perhaps it offered unexpected opportunity. He found Kaufmann in the estate's reception hall, a sturdy man of 50, with the particular confidence of successful merchants who'd learned that money spoke louder than titles in the modern world. "My friend!" Kaufmann exclaimed in accented Polish, grasping our kennel master's hand with both of his. "When you didn't respond to my last 3 letters, I worried you'd found another buyer for your bloodlines. My apologies. I've been engaged with urgent matters here. So I see. A grand estate, and I hear whispers in the servants' quarters about mysterious events, sick dogs, confessions. Very dramatic, very Polish." Prince Radziński chose that moment to appear, drawn perhaps by word of a foreign merchant in his house. The two men assessed each other with the mutual wariness of old nobility and new money, predator and competitor, occupying the same territory. "Your Excellency," our kennel master said carefully, "may I present Herr Kaufmann from Berlin? He's interested in purchasing breeding rights from my kennel." "German dogs are superior, they say," the prince observed coldly. "For some purposes," Kaufmann replied diplomatically, "but Polish lines have qualities we've lost through too much refinement, hardiness, intelligence, independence. Your hunting traditions preserved traits our scientific breeding accidentally eliminated." It was the right answer. Prince Radziński's posture softened marginally. "You've come far for dogs." "I've come for excellence, Your Excellency. And perhaps," Kaufmann paused, calculating, "to witness something remarkable.
The servants speak of a great hunt in December, a wager of honor. In Berlin, we hear stories of Polish hunts like other people hear legends. Our kennel master watched this delicate dance, recognizing Kaufmann's strategy.
The merchant hadn't survived in Berlin's competitive market without learning to read men's vanities. "Perhaps you should stay," the prince said suddenly. "Witness our December hunt yourself. See if Polish traditions deserve German gold." The invitation surprised everyone, including Prince Radzinski himself. But our protagonist understood. The prince saw opportunity to demonstrate Polish superiority to a German witness, to prove his world still held value. Later, in the privacy of the kennels, Kaufmann revealed his true purpose. "I need 20 pointer puppies by spring. My clients include the Kaiser's second cousin. But I also heard about this wager, this drama with the Borzoi. 800 rubles is significant money." "You're offering to cover Pavel's debt?" "I'm offering to bet on the dog myself. If she wins, I pay you directly for the puppies at premium price. If she loses, I pay nothing and find another supplier." Our kennel master considered this. Kaufmann's involvement would add pressure, but also opportunity. "You understand she's been traumatized. Her recovery isn't certain. I understand that desperate men find strength they didn't know existed. This groom, this Pavel, he'll work miracles because he must." Indeed, Pavel was already working with devotion that bordered on obsession. He'd moved a cot into the kennels, spending every hour with Złota, rebuilding trust through endless patience. He'd developed a routine: morning runs along paths far from the haunted wall, afternoon training with freshly caught hares, evening sessions of simple companionship, reminding the dog that human presence meant safety, not betrayal. Our protagonist found him that afternoon, teaching Złota new commands, using hand signals rather than voice, adapting to her increased sensitivity to sound. The golden Borzoi responded with growing confidence, her natural grace returning incrementally. "She's faster than before," Pavel said quietly. "As if the trauma sharpened her instincts, or perhaps she runs from memories now. Both can be true. Pain teaches us things comfort never could." Mikhail Petrovich appeared, carrying his eternal ledger. "The prince wants numbers. Costs for the December hunt, probability of success, everything quantified." "Some things can't be reduced to numbers," our kennel master replied. "Everything can be counted," the Russian insisted. Złota's speed measured in seconds. The competition's records documented precisely. Even courage can be calculated through past performance. "And trust? How do you quantify a dog learning to trust again?" The manager had no answer for that. He departed muttering about Polish mysticism, leaving our protagonist to observe Pavel's patient work. The groom had developed a signal system with Złota, allowing her to indicate distress without panic. When overwhelmed, she would touch his hand with her nose and he would immediately pause the training, offering comforts without coddling. Prince Radzinski arrived as the sun began setting, painting the November sky in shades of amber that matched Złota's coat. He watched his dog work through a complex hunting sequence, her movements regaining their legendary fluid precision. "My grandfather's dogs were never this well trained," he admitted. "We relied on breeding alone, assumed bloodlines guaranteed excellence." "Bloodlines provide potential, Your Excellency. Training reveals it. And trauma? Trauma tests everything. Some break, some bend, some become stronger at the broken places. The prince was quiet for a moment, watching Pavel guide Złota through increasingly complex maneuvers. I've decided about the bet. If Złota wins, Pavel keeps half his winnings after the debt is paid. The other half goes to establish a fund for estate workers' emergencies. No more desperate wagers born from temporary crises. It was unexpectedly progressive, this acknowledgement that economic desperation drove good people to bad choices. Our kennel master wondered if the prince, facing his own estate's decline, had developed empathy for those trapped by circumstances. "There's something else," Prince Radzinski continued. "Young Janek, the boy shows aptitude. I'm appointing him as apprentice kennel master officially. He'll study with Pavel and report to you when you visit. Poland needs to preserve its knowledge, pass it to the next generation before the Russians or Germans erase it all." That evening, our protagonist dined with Kaufman in the estate's lesser dining room, discussing bloodlines and breeding programs, while larger currents swirled around them. The German merchant was shrewd but fair, understanding that sustainable business required mutual benefit. "This place," Kaufman observed, gesturing at the faded grandeur surrounding them. "It's ending, isn't it? This whole world of nobles and estates. All worlds end. The question is what we preserve from them." "You sound like a philosopher." "I breed dogs, Herr Kaufmann. I see generations compressed into years, watch bloodlines rise and fall, observe how traits persist or vanish. It teaches you about time, about change, about what matters enough to save." Through the window, they could see Pavel still working with Złota in the fading light, patient as stone, determined as water wearing down rock. Agnieszka had brought him supper, standing beside her husband with one hand on his shoulder, the other on her growing belly. Future and present united in desperate hope. "Will she win?" Kaufman asked. Our kennel master considered the question. Złota was healing. Pavel was dedicated. The December hunt would bring the finest dogs from surrounding estates. Victory wasn't certain, but then nothing ever was. "She'll run," he said finally. "After what she's survived, running itself is victory. The rest is just numbers in ledgers, coins changing hands, pride measured against pride." But even as he spoke, our protagonist knew it was more than that. It was about trust rebuilt from betrayal, about mercy extended despite justice, about the small, private victories that let ordinary people survive extraordinary circumstances. The real wager wasn't about money or dogs or Polish versus Russian pride. It was about whether broken things could be made whole enough to serve their purpose once more. November 15th dawned clear and sharp, the kind of morning that reminded everyone winter was no longer approaching, but arrived. Our kennel master stood with young Janek at the training field, watching Złota chase mechanical lures, leather strips soaked in hair scent, pulled by ropes and pulleys in unpredictable patterns that Pavel had devised during his sleepless nights. "She's different," Janek observed, his apprentice eyes already learning to read the subtle language of movement. "Not just recovered, changed." Indeed, Złota ran with a new economy of motion, as if her brush with madness had burned away all excess, leaving only pure purpose. Where once she'd run for joy, she now ran with intent, each stride calculated, each turn precise.
The trauma hadn't broken her, it had refined her, like fire purifies gold. Pavel managed the pulley system with focused intensity, his wife Agnieszka beside him, recording times in a small notebook. They'd developed their own system of measurement, not just speed, but recovery time, breathing rates, the angle of her turns.
Data that Mikhail Petrovich would approve of, though born from intuition rather than Russian methodology. 14 seconds faster than yesterday, Agnieszka announced, and her breathing steadies quicker. Herr Kaufmann approached from the manor, having spent the morning examining our protagonist's breeding records with Germanic thoroughness. Your prince has invited me to judge the December hunt alongside the local nobility. An interesting choice. A German merchant validating Polish tradition, or ensuring no one can claim bias when Złota wins, our kennel master suggested. If she wins, I've been making inquiries. The merchant from Krakow, the one with the fighting dog, his animal is formidable, a crossbreed of Mastiff and Wolfhound, trained in the mountains where the air is thin and prey is scarce. Through the morning, visitors arrived to observe Złota's recovery. News of the scandal had spread through the district's estates, transforming what should have been shame into something else, a test of Polish resilience, perhaps, or simple human curiosity about whether the mad dog and desperate groom could redeem themselves. Father Stanisław blessed the training field with elaborate ceremony, sprinkling holy water that froze almost immediately on the ground. God favors the penitent, he declared loudly enough for all to hear, though his eyes held the shrewd calculation of a man who understood that public redemption stories served many purposes. Prince Rudzinski watched from his tower window, a distant figure maintaining the separation proper to his station. Yet our protagonist had noticed fresh wheel tracks leading to the kennels in early morning frost. The prince had been visiting Złota in secret, perhaps remembering when he too had been young and desperate to prove himself worthy of inheritance. I need to speak with you, Mikhail Petrovich said, appearing at our kennel master's elbow with his usual sudden efficiency. They walked apart from the others, toward the old wall that had been the source of so much trouble. Dmitri sent word from Warsaw, the manager said quietly. He's found work in the imperial stables, claims to have learned valuable lessons here. But he also sent this. He produced a folded paper, a betting slip he never submitted. 1,000 rubles on Złota to win, placed before he began the Annis scheme. Our protagonist studied the document. He was playing both sides? It appears so. Create the crisis, then bet on the recovery. He knew Pavel would work miracles to save himself. Counted on it. The Annis was meant to be discovered, the confession designed to seem forced. And you tell me this because? Because I'm Russian, not stupid. This estate, these people, they're my responsibility now. Their failures reflect on me. If Złota wins, it validates my management. If she loses, I'm the Russian who couldn't even maintain Polish traditions properly. The complexity of motivations surrounding one golden dog had become almost comic, yet our kennel master understood that this was how history actually worked, not through grand gestures, but through accumulated small desperations, each person pursuing private salvation that somehow wove into larger patterns. That afternoon, he worked with Janek on recognizing signs of stress in animals. The boy proved an eager student,
already developing the patient observation that distinguished true kennel masters from mere handlers. "My father thinks I'm forgetting my place," Yannick confided. "Says serving nobles never ends well for common folk." Your father survived by knowing his limits. You'll survive by carefully expanding them. Different times require different strategies. Will you come back after December? To deliver Kaufman's puppies in spring, certainly.
Beyond that, our protagonist paused, watching Złota execute a perfect turn around an obstacle. Dogs teach us that loyalty isn't about staying in one place. It's about returning when needed. As evening approached, an unexpected drama unfolded. The merchant from Krakow arrived early, ostensibly to inspect the hunting grounds, but clearly to intimidate. His dog was indeed impressive, massive, scarred, with the dead eyes of an animal trained through cruelty rather than cooperation. "So this is the famous Złota," he sneered, watching her work. "Pretty thing, delicate. My Brutus will crush her like a flower." Powell's hands clenched, but our kennel master touched his arm in warning. Let the merchant posture. It revealed his weakness, reliance on force rather than finesse. "Perhaps a practice run," the merchant suggested. "Let everyone see what December will bring." Prince Radzinski had emerged from the manor, drawn by the commotion. "My dog runs in December as agreed." "Not before. Afraid she'll be exposed as the fraud I've heard she's become? Mad dog, they say, sees ghosts." The provocation was obvious but effective. The gathered crowd muttered, doubt spreading like infection. Our protagonist saw Złota react to the tension, her newly sensitive nature reading human emotion with painful accuracy. Then, Agnieszka did something unexpected. Heavily pregnant, moving with careful dignity, she walked directly to Złota and knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around the golden neck. "She's not mad," she said clearly. "She was hurt by those who should have protected her. But she's healing, because that's what the strong do. They heal and continue." The moment held surprising power. The pregnant peasant woman defending the noble's dog, finding in Złota's story an echo of every woman who'd survived betrayal through sheer determination. Even the merchant seemed momentarily uncertain. "December 15th, Prince Radzinski repeated firmly. "We'll settle all accounts then." As the crowd dispersed, our kennel master found himself alone with Złota. She approached him cautiously, this man who'd exposed her torment, but also ended it. He extended his scarred hand, letting her investigate at her own pace. When she finally pressed her nose into his palm, he felt the warm breath of absolution, not for his role in the investigation, but for the larger human failing of creating a world where such investigations were necessary. That night he made final notes in his journal about treatment protocols for trauma in hunting dogs. But between the technical observations, other thoughts crept in. About trust and betrayal, about the prices people paid for security, about the walls humans built and the ghosts they created to explain their own cruelties. Tomorrow he would return to his own kennels, leaving Złota's fate to those whose lives depended on it. But tonight, he stood at his window watching the moon rise over Sokolniki, painting the estate in silver light that made everything seem possible, even redemption for a golden dog and the desperate people whose hopes rode on her healing legs. The wall where it had all began stood innocent in the moonlight, just old stones holding up a building, no longer haunted by anything but memory. Sometimes, our kennel master reflected, The best resolution was simply to clean away the poison and let time do its work. Dogs understood this instinctively. Humans had to learn it through harder lessons. The letter arrived on December 21st, when snow had already claimed the Polish countryside for its long winter reign. Our kennel master sat in his workshop, the same bench where 6 weeks ago he'd received Prince Radzinski's original summons, now reading young Janek's carefully penned account of what had transpired at the great hunt.
"Honored teacher," the letter began, the formality touching in its earnestness. "I write, as you instructed, to record not just events but their meaning. As you say, dogs teach us to see beyond the obvious." Through Janek's words, the scene unfolded. December 15th had dawned gray and threatening, clouds heavy with unspent snow. The assembled nobility and merchants had gathered at Sokolniki like carrion birds, drawn by the scent of impending disaster or triumph. The merchant from Krakow had arrived with an entourage, his massive Brutus straining against chains that seemed more theatrical than necessary. Złota had entered the field like a different creature entirely. Where once she'd bounded with joy, she now moved with controlled purpose, her golden coat gleaming against the frost-covered ground. Pavel walked beside her, his hand occasionally touching her shoulder, not for control, but for reassurance, a reminder of their shared journey through darkness.
The hunt itself, Janek wrote, was almost anticlimactic in its decisiveness. Brutus had raw power, but no finesse, crashing through undergrowth like a battering ram, scattering prey in all directions. Złota moved like water finding its course, anticipating the hare's movements with an almost supernatural precision that had nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with trauma, having sharpened her instincts to a razor's edge. She caught 7 hares to Brutus's 3, Janek reported with evident pride. But more importantly, she ran without fear, without hesitation. When she passed the old kennels where the wall had tormented her, she didn't even glance at it. Our protagonist set down the letter and gazed out at his own kennels, where a new litter of pointer puppies tumbled over each other in the snow, their spots making them look like scattered dice against white cloth. Herr Kaufmann's deposit had already arrived, ensuring the kennel's survival through winter and beyond. The German merchant, true to his word, had validated Złota's victory with Teutonic precision, leaving no room for dispute. But Janek's letter contained more than just the hunt's outcome. He wrote of the aftermath, how Prince Radzinski had publicly forgiven Pavel before the assembled guests, transforming shame into a lesson about redemption that even the Russian officials couldn't criticize. How Pavel's winnings had not only cleared his debt, but established the promised fund for estate workers, with Agnieszka appointed to manage it, her practical wisdom recognized despite her humble origins. "The prince says I'm to continue learning," Janek wrote with barely contained excitement. "Not just about dogs, but about breeding records, bloodlines, even Latin names for anatomical parts. He says Poland's future lies in preserving knowledge in whatever vessels will hold it, even common boys like me." There was wisdom in that, our kennel master reflected.
Empires rose and fell. Nobles lost their lands, but knowledge passed from hand to hand persisted. The techniques for reading a dog's distress, for building trust after betrayal, for recognizing the difference between genuine madness and manufactured terror. These would outlive any political arrangement. A postscript in different handwriting caught his eye. Pavel had added his own note. "Sir, Agnieszka delivered our son 3 days after the hunt. We've named him Tomasz, not for the ghost in the wall, but for the truth
that sometimes our worst moments teach us who we really are. Złota was present at the birth, Agnieszka insisted, and the dog lay beside her through the entire ordeal, as if standing guard. They understand each other now, two females who survived men's foolishness and emerged stronger. Our protagonist smiled at this. Trust between species often proved more durable than trust within them. Dogs forgave with a completeness humans rarely achieved, perhaps because they lived without the burden of anticipating future betrayals. The workshop door opened, bringing a gust of winter air and his neighbor, Stanislav, not the priest, but the practical farmer who'd tended the kennels during his absence. "Letter from Sokolniki?" the neighbor asked, settling his bulk on a storage chest that creaked ominously. "Young Yannick, reporting on the hunt's outcome. Heard about that even here. Polish dog beats all comers. Desperate groom becomes hero. Noble shows mercy. Almost like a fairy tale. Fairy tales don't usually include anise oil and gambling debts." Stanislav laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "No, but they include transformation. Beast becomes prince. Servant becomes master. Mad dog becomes champion. People need such stories, especially now, when everything Polish is being systematically erased." Our kennel master considered this as he prepared the evening feed. Perhaps that was why Prince Rosinski had made such a public spectacle of forgiveness, why he'd invited a German merchant to witness Polish excellence, why he'd elevated a peasant boy to keeper of knowledge. Small acts of preservation disguised as practical decisions. That night, unable to sleep, he walked among his kennels under stars sharp as glass in the winter sky. The dogs stirred at his presence, a few whining softly in greeting. He stopped at the pen of an old Borzoi bitch he'd acquired years ago, past breeding age but kept for her temperament. She pressed against the wire and he rubbed her graying muzzle, thinking of Złota. The investigation at Sokolniki had begun with a ghost story and ended with multiple human truths about desperation, pride, mercy, and the price of survival in a changing world. The anise on the wall had been real, the dog's torment genuine, but underneath lay deeper hauntings, the specters of poverty, of cultural extinction, of men and women trapped between old loyalties and new necessities. In his pocket, he carried another letter, this one from Kaufmann, already planning next year's breeding program. The German wrote of new techniques, scientific approaches to selection, the future of dog breeding as precise as engineering. All probably true, our kennel master thought, but something would be lost in that precision. The intuitive understanding that came from sleeping beside sick puppies, from reading a dog's character in the set of its tail, from knowing that sometimes the best dogs emerged not from perfect circumstances, but from surviving imperfect ones. A wolf howled somewhere in the distance, a sound that raised primitive responses in both man and dog. The kennels erupted briefly in answering calls before settling back to silence. Our protagonist stood in the snow, a middle-aged man with scarred hands and accumulated wisdom about creatures that served humans with a dedication humanity rarely deserved. Tomorrow, he would begin selecting puppies for Kaufmann's order, applying both traditional knowledge and modern methods. He would write to Janek with instructions for Złota's continued training, suggestions for managing her newfound sensitivity.
He would continue his correspondence with various estates, offering expertise to those whose dogs suffered from mysterious ailments that usually proved all too human in origin. But tonight, he simply stood in the Polish winter, surrounded by sleeping dogs and falling snow, thinking about walls, both visible and invisible, about the ghosts we create to explain our cruelties, and about the remarkable capacity of living things to heal from wounds that should have destroyed them.
The church bell in the distant village chimed midnight, its bronze voice carrying across frozen fields. December 21st, the longest night of the year, after which the light would slowly return. An appropriate date, our kennel master thought, to receive news of redemption, of debts paid and trust rebuilt. He made his way back to the house, his bad legs stiff with cold, leaving footprints that would be covered by morning snow. Behind him, the kennels settled into peaceful silence, their occupants dreaming whatever dreams dogs dream, probably of running, of catching, of the simple joy of purpose fulfilled. Unlike humans, they didn't dream of ghosts because they had no need to disguise their nature behind supernatural explanations. The truth was always simpler and more complex than any ghost story. Beings shaped by circumstance, doing what they must to survive, occasionally finding grace in unexpected places.
Swota had been saved, not by exposing a ghost, but by revealing the very human tendency to create hauntings where only hurt existed, and then, sometimes, to exorcise them through the patient work of trust rebuilt, one careful day at a time.